not just about, I mean, it says Elimination Act, right? Like we want to eliminate this from even happening at all, but we can't just jump to that. There's steps along the way. So if we work on prevention, then we work on detection, like we've got to even know that it's happening. So there are a lot of standards around reporting, prevention, detection, response, like how are we then going to respond when someone says that an incident has occurred, and then data monitoring. How can we check to make sure that things are actually working? Does that help answer your question a little bit? And we can jump to this one real quick just to give you a framework of one of the standards, and this is for the youthful inmate standard. This one is specific to adult prisons and jails. And because it's looking at individuals who are under the age of 18 that are housed in adult facilities. Oftentimes this means, so this is obviously in jurisdictions where youth can be sentenced as adults. Oftentimes now, it's often like 16 and 17-year-olds that fall into this. Sometimes it's just 17-year-olds. Yet regardless, we know that that's one of the risk factors for being sexual violence being perpetrated against them. I can go back and I'll show you some other risk factors, but being under the age of 18 is one of them. And so this standard has a number of subsections. An important thing about the PREA standards is that in order to be in compliance, it's not just sort of a like, yeah, they're doing okay. They have to be 100% in compliance with every provision of the standard. So this standard, for example, has 3 different provisions. So there's subsection A. Let's hear. Is that the one before? Oh no, it's right here. So we'll just go through this. So a youthful inmate, again, in the definitions, you would see that someone under the age of 18 shall not be placed in a housing unit in which they will have sight, sound, or physical contact with any adult inmate through the use of a shared day room or other common space, shower area, or sleeping quarters. So this is a tough one. I'll stop right there because this is frankly the hardest part for facilities. How many of you can hear the doorbell when it rings? Right? You can hear it. So we're not sound separated from the doorbell. We can't see the doorbell, so we're sight separated, but that's one of the standards, is that they have to be sight and sound separated. So you can imagine you're in a cell, even if the youth is single celled, they might still be able to hear other people through the air ducts, just yelling, that sort of thing. And so one of the standards is that they have to be sight and sound separated from adults, so anyone that's 18 years of age or older. And in some jurisdictions, they may only have a couple of youthful inmates in their custody at any given time. And so what happens is they really struggle. Well, what do we do? What do we do with these individuals? And so some of the work that we do is talking with them about having them converse with some of their neighboring jurisdictions. So let's say a jail only has a couple of youth in their custody at any given time. Well, talk with your neighboring jurisdictions. My guess is that they're in a similar boat. So is there a way that you can pool resources and work collaboratively to designate a unit for youthful inmates versus, you trying to set up an entire unit at your facility for just 1 or 2 youth? So that's frankly one of the hardest things across all the standards. This is one of the hardest things for people to come into compliance with. This is sight and sound separation of youth in an adult facility. But you can see they're sort of reasonable, right? So outside of a housing unit, they can have sight and sound separation, or they can provide direct staff supervision. So this is to ensure that the youth aren't penalized just because they're a youth. And we'll go to this here. I think it's this one. Yeah, so you can see that it also says in here that they have to, unless there's some unforeseen circumstance, that's what we mean by exigent circumstance. So you can't just say, oh, well, we didn't have a staff person available for that, to do direct supervision of that youthful inmate or something. That's not an exigent circumstance. An exigent circumstance would be like a riot, an earthquake, a hurricane. I mean, it has to be something that's really unforeseen and unpredictable and temporary. So you can see that that youth can't be denied exercise, special education services, other programming and work opportunities to the extent possible. And they can't just default isolate them. And frankly, that's what people end up doing, is they say, well, we don't have enough youth to designate an entire unit. It's really expensive, right, in terms of manpower to designate a whole unit, designate staff when there's only, say a unit technically could hold, 20 or 30 people or more, and we only have 2 youth, to then provide staffing for those 2 youth. Like, it's really resource intensive. So they just default to isolation. So one of the things that when we work with our auditors is that they have to demonstrate that if they are housing a youth in isolation, that was like, they've tried other things and that was the only thing that would work. That there was absolutely no other way that they could meet that standard of sight and sound separation and still keep that youth safe, except to house them in isolation. Now, they can be housed, they can do something where they just have that youth in isolation just for sleeping hours, just for that part of things, but then we go back to, then they might be able to provide that direct staff supervision during other times, during other programming or school or work assignments. So, but correctional facilities they're very black and white. Like, I don't know how much experience you all have, but it's very black and white. So it's like, we either can do it or we can't. And so a lot of the work that we do is trying to help them find that middle ground. Like, let's find ways that you might be able to make this work for your facilities. And that's part of what the auditors go out and do as well. Does that help answer your question about like the standard and? Okay. So I was going to get to this a bit later, but we're there now. Any questions about the standard or this standard in particular? Yeah.
The wording is really similar to the sight and sound part of the JJDPA. Is there a reason for that? Like, is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, these standards come from Department of Justice, and the JJDPA Act also falls under Department of Justice. And yes, there are parallels. So when Department of Justice was putting together these standards, they had a whole working group that met to develop these standards. And it did have people from Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention weighing in on them. And so they're not exactly the same, but they mirror each other, or there's a lot of overlap, and that's exactly why. And in fact, the Department of Justice has a PREA working group that meets twice a month to this day, because part of what happens is these standards come out and then there are a lot of questions. And even though the people who wrote the standards put a lot of time and effort into it and thinking through all the different permutations and thinking through all the well, not this scenario, but this scenario, and what are the different permutations, there's still questions. And so what they do is they then continue to issue interpretive guidance. They can't actually change the standards. That would literally take an act of Congress, yet they can offer interpretive guidance. So if you go to our website, there's a frequently asked questions tab, and you can go in there and see the different kinds of questions that have been asked, and then what the Department of Justice has come out with in terms of additional interpretive guidance for the standards. Other questions? No? Okay, so I'm going to jump back just because I think to talk a little bit more about the impact of sexual violence in detention. So these are sort of big picture stereotypes, and in the chunk of the presentation that we probably won't get to today that talks about juveniles and youth and juvenile facilities, but these are some myths and stereotypes, frankly. And I don't think that these are limited to sexual violence in detention. I mean, I think that they're sort of big picture. I mean, think about it. Sexual violence is underreported in the free world, as they call it, right? Mm-hmm. So let's not even talk about how underreported it is in a confinement setting, right? So now you're in this like isolated kind of universe. What's the likelihood that you're going to report that something has happened to you? I think this one is a big one that we've had to dispel, that sexual abusers are the perpetrators. The ones who are perpetrating sexual violence are gay. That's not it at all. It's not about sex. It's about power and control. That's what sexual violence is. It's not about the actual act of sex. It's about power and control. Staff that have had sex with inmates were manipulated. No, not so much that either. What we find, though, is that staff sexual misconduct. So PREA, talks about both inmate on inmate or resident on resident sexual abuse, but it also deals with staff sexual misconduct. So there is no place in the U.S. where even if a staff member and an inmate or a resident said they were both, it was truly consensual, it is not allowed. Not allowed, because it's against the law because of the imbalance of power. And so what they've done is they've done research to say, well, why is this happening? Why is this a problem with staff sexual misconduct? And it's a number of things. I mean, sometimes with respect to women's staff, sometimes, maybe they've gone through they've got some relationship troubles in their own personal life. They have some kind of vulnerability that sometimes the inmates pick up on. It could be the same could be true for men. It could be about power, that male staff just, want to control and exert power over some of the women that are in their custody. Does same-sex staff sexual misconduct happen? Absolutely. Like, you name it, it happens. And so that's certainly an issue that has to be addressed. Let's see here, what other things on here? Obviously this first one, that sexual abuse is inevitable in confinement. I think, one of the organizations, Just Detention International, they had this whole campaign about, that's not part of the penalty. And I think if you talk to corrections officials, people have really kind of come around and recognizing that PREA big picture, implementing the PREA standards is just good corrections. It's good, sound correctional practice. This is where the correctional field needs to go. And stuff like that, like sexual abuse, is not part of the punishment. I don't know. I think I'm too hypersensitive now. Whenever I watch anything on TV, I swear almost every night there's some reference to sexual violence in confinement, about, you don't drop the soap. I've watched Simpsons episodes where there's been a reference about that. It's a little crazy, how desensitized I think we are about this issue, but it's not part of it shouldn't be part of the penalty. And so we really have to address this. All right, let me keep going so I won't ramble about that anymore. So just some consequences for victims. Obviously, lots of mental health issues. So many people come with mental health issues anyways into our confinement facilities, and this just compounds it. A large number, especially of women, come with some kind of abuse history to confinement. And so, what the statistics show is that someone who has been sexually abused previously is at greater risk of being sexually abused again. Whether that sexual abuse took place outside of confinement or inside of confinement, they are at greater risk. And obviously all of these other things, I think if I just asked you to kind of shout out what would be some of the risk factor or some of the repercussions for folks who are sexually abused in confinement, you'd probably come up with a lot of these. So one of the standards, going back to this prevention idea, is around screening. So when someone comes into a facility, they're supposed to be screened. They use that for classification and housing purposes, but specific to PREA, they do screening for risk of perpetration or risk of victimization. And so it doesn't have to be a validated instrument, so it doesn't have to be such a rigorous instrument, but it has to be objective. It has to be tailored to the facility. Even say a Department of Corrections that has lots of different facilities, the culture is not going to be the same at all of those facilities. Think about on a college campus, there's lots of dormitories, but there's a culture for each of those, and that culture does change over time. And so what happens is that individuals come in, they have to be screened. There's a list of about 10 screening factors that is listed in the PREA standards, and they can certainly add more, but that's sort of the baseline of what they need to be assessed on. And then it's the facility, in terms of being objective, to take that information and synthesize it. What does that mean if you check yes on a number of these factors? Where does that put you in terms of risk of perpetrating sexual violence or at risk for being a victim? Some of the things with that we've found challenging is that, so one of them is asking about if the individual is or perceived to be LGBTI. So on the one hand, just asking someone, are you LGBTI, that is a huge barrier for folks in corrections. They are not comfortable doing that. And so we've done a lot of training around, well, you know what? You just need to ask that question of everyone. It's not about, because they're afraid that someone will say, what do you think, I'm gay? Well, no, but if you ask everyone, tell me what your sexual orientation is, and you list out what all those are, then you're asking it of everyone, and you're not, making any specific assumptions about any one person. But then staff really get riled up about this idea of